Okay, thanks very much, Ben. Thanks to Kevin and the CPGB, who's not here, and the CPGB for inviting me to speak. It's much appreciated. The first question, so yeah, this is covering this is going to be like a whistle-stop tour, really, of some of the themes of the CPGB's first couple of decades. 1920 to 1941. So we're going to take it, from its formation through to the early years of the Second World War. The first question I'm going to just briefly answer before I go into it is why the CPGB, why the Communist Party of Great Britain, why should we study it, why should we obtain confidence of it in relation to unity? The creation of the CPGB was, I would argue, the most advanced political achievement of the working class in Britain in 1920, which I'm going to kind of elaborate on why I kind of think that. But just to qualify that straight away, I don't have any belief really that there was a golden age of the CPGB. It's very common in theories of the CPGB, whether that be Euro-communist or Trotskyist, to look back to a period that was like a golden age, either before Lenin's death or, in the case of the Euro-communists, the Popular Front periods of the 1930s or the 1940s. I don't have any kind of conception. So whenever I'm discussing the CPGB, I kind of take it for granted that it's a story of an organisation with a lot of warts and that had problems kind of from day one. So I don't have any. I don't have any particular, although I'm an incredibly sentimental person, I'm not particularly sentimental about the history of the CPG because I actually don't think it really helps you understand things. But before I kind of get into the weeds of discussing the CPGB and the travails of unity, I actually did want to discuss something about the concept of unity. Now, when I was first thinking about this, I was kind of thinking that I'd sort of give you like a mini philosophical rundown, because obviously unity, in philosophy, is an old problem. The question of the one and the many that goes down back to Parmenides of Greek philosophy. But I'm not going to bore you with it because we haven't got time. And I thought it would be just more interesting to talk about some of the concepts of unity as we know them on the left. The most kind of common form of understanding of unity is one that has got a very noble sentiment behind it, and that's unity is strength. Okay, we are all one. We all stand together. We're all the same. We all fight together. We struggle together. We eat together. We win together. That's the kind of sentiment behind that. And it is a noble idea, but in kind of left-wing discourse, it's become slightly kind of perverted down the years, as we know, by left-wing sects and not even left-wing sects or organisations such as the Labour Party, taking that idea one step beyond that, where left-wing kind of sects, they tend to be united, or they tend to want to be united on things like the theory of the Soviet Union, or as I was talking to one ex-SWP member during lockdown, and he told me that if you wanted to have a really united party, you needed to agree on the derivation of philosophy down from Hegel into Marx, and you needed to take on board, you had to agree with Lukács and Korsch's critique of mechanistic Marxism, and there was the lady, was it Raya Donskaya? Yeah, so you had to agree with that, and this is of course a unity, and you had to have that. You all had to agree on state capitalism, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You know the story. But the problem with that type of unity is it, as we all kind of know, it quickly becomes oppressive, and it produces very brittle organisations that split very quickly and that are frankly useless for any kind of long-term kind of project other than sect formation and continuation. When these kind of groups go into the movement at large, outside their little group, they go into the movement on the basis of something called 80-20. We all agree on 80%. So we'll just talk about the 80% till the cows come home. And then there's the other 20%, which we're never ever going to mention that really. But we'll just mention it once, and it's a way of exercising the devil, just by 20%. We don't talk about that, and that's been a prevalent kind of method since the kind of arena of the socialist alliances. So, but what this means in broad campaigns, of course, is when you add, say it was Ben and Stop the War movement and Yasmin wanting to introduce Hopi resolutions, hands off the people of Iran. They had to, I can't remember what happened, but they were either ruled out of order. We can't have that type of unity where there's difference. So actually the 20% of the formulation is redundant and useless. It's never allowed to happen. Again, these campaigns, they produce very little in terms of lasting kind of impact on the class struggle. Stop the War movement was clearly like a huge thing. And where's that now? What happened to it? Where did it go? It's partly that reason is because of this silly 20% where you never talk about the 20%, and you end up making deals with the Liberal Democrats and letting them speak off your platform, etc., etc., etc. So that's the negative version of unity. Okay, that's the negative kind of concept of it. The kind of alternative to this, the more positive version, is to have a kind of idea, but yeah, we are all united. We have a unity and diversity. Okay, so e.g., I don't know, just to give an example. Say I don't know, I've known John, say, for like 30 years, and we probably, we've had a lot of agreement in that time, we've had a fair amount of disagreement, but probably if people saw me and John, if people outside the kind of left-wing circles saw me and John talking in the pub, they'd think, fucking hell, they're comrades, they've got an awful lot in kind of common. There's that kind of unity. You can be, you could have unity for unity in the cause of a communist party without necessarily being in the same factions or agreeing on everything or agreeing on the feeling of Soviet Union. You can be united around a program and your strategic goals. And kind of an example of this, comrades probably know about seeing this famous photograph. Obviously, Lenin had an awful lot of disputes with Bogdanov during his kind of political career, both in the Bolshevik faction and outside it. But I don't know whether comrades have actually seen the picture of Lenin and Bogdanov playing chess. Yeah. Playing chess in Capri. Capri. Yeah. Yeah, they weren't playing chess in the Ford Capri. There's not enough room on the back seat for my dad tells me. So my dad used to have a Ford Capri that he used to take ladies around. Yeah, but so Bogdanov and Lenin were in. They had lots of disagreements and violent disagreements. So although Lenin, famously expelled Bogdanov from the faction, he didn't expel him from the party. And if you look at Lenin's critiques of Bogdanov, he's actually very clear that Bogdanov is a principled militant kind of communist who's in comrade. But that's the kind of perfect example of you can be united in a party. You don't have to have this kind of faction or sect discipline that people have to split if you disagree on philosophy or science or whatever that is. So that's a more positive version of unity, but the knock-on effect of those more positive forms of united kind of organizations that are able to accept diversity, because it has a knock-on effect on how they deal with the class as a whole. Organizations that conceive their own differences and can recognize their own differences as part of their party life tend to be those organizations that are able to actually perceive as the working class as a differentiated group, as the working class having its own rationality and the ability to take on debates and kind of ideas. Whereas sect organizations' version of unity, that tends to breed a pretty foul attitude towards working class people, that they're simpletons that need to be administered to. And yeah, so that you get these two different kind of conceptions. They breed a different view of like the working class and its capabilities, and that the unity in diversity is clearly a more enlightened approach. Now, in this kind of narrative I'm going to tell you about, those two poles, which are quite crude poles that I've kind of sketched out, you're going to kind of see them kind of in action really in the first 20 years of the CPGB. I'm not going to wait and tell you what, oh, it's coming now. I'm not going to say anything like that. If you'll see how these poles kind of bend together, and you'll see how that forms part of the story, and you see the way these two poles are present in the story of the early history of the CPGB. So I'm going to start going into some of the narrative of what occurred during those 20 years now. Just sorry to disappoint Trotskyists in the organisation. I'm not going to go through inch by inch how the CPGB followed the line of the kind of Comintern. I do think that's a really important relationship, but it's not something I'm going to particularly concentrate on here. But you can kind of take it for read that I understand that the Soviet Union is a big structural part, and Stalin's leadership was a big factor in distorting the CPGB. But the problem with that kind of thing is that I think it obscures the problems the CPGB actually had from its foundation. That's why I don't particularly push that, but I'm not denying that. And a lot of the things I'm going to be talking about, you can't have a history of the CPGB without the Soviet Union or the CPSU. You can't do that. It's just what I'm kind of more interested in is how the Communist Party of Great Britain mediated those structural pressures and those structural forces, and how it actually worked out in the party itself, rather than just understanding it as some kind of external other that's just impacting down on the party. So I talked a bit about the beginning about creation of the CPGB and how it was the most advanced political achievement of the working class in Britain. The reason I kind of say that really is because it represented a coming together of like existing left-wing organisations to potentially overcome their kind of sect kind of amateurishness and their sect kind of narrowness. Obviously, it was done in cohort with the Comintern, which had a very positive impact upon that. But the coming together of the CPGB was fundamentally coming together of factions in one party. So it was the British Socialist Party, the Communist Unity Group of the Socialist Labour Party, various ILP branches and quite a few individuals in the ILP, South Wales Socialist Society. There was a whole heap there. There was also industrial militants of various stands and independent groups as well. So it was a coming together. It was a coming together of factions, and this was pretty much the scheme of Theodore Rothstein, who'd been an emigre working in organisations such as the British Socialist Party. It was pretty much his scheme. There was an alternative scheme actually, which was proposed by Sam, Pakula, who became Sam Palm Dutt's wife. She was a Comintern emissary, and she's kind of really in the first 2 decades of the CPGB. She's really the hidden power really behind the throne. If you look at the documentation that you can now find in the CPGB archive, and you look at Pollitt and Palm Dutt's papers, Harry Pollitt became the General Secretary in 1929. Rajani Palm Dutt was the editor of Labour Monthly. He came from the ILP. And these were the 2 future kind of leaders of it. Palm Dutt ran a magazine called Labour Monthly, which some of you will obviously know about. But Sam Dutt was really the power behind these 2 throws, because she had the authority of the Comintern, kind of one thing. And also she came from, she had like relations in Finland and were also involved in the Comintern. And she was pretty much, but she had an alternative scheme to Boston. She didn't actually want to go through what she saw with the existing sects. She wanted to set up committees of left-wing workers and industrial militants to set up the CPGB, but it was her project. It wasn't agreed to. In a sense, I probably think because the Bolsheviks kind of knew the level organisations they were dealing with, and to some extent they fought alongside them. But that's another, I don't want to get too deeply into that, but that's just to let you know that that wasn't the only conception. But fundamentally, we've got these coming together of all of these organisations, and actually really, so you think that this was like so that's a positive kind of moment of kind of unity and diversity, that you brought together all these factions, and it impacted upon the way, if you look at the process in which it was reported in British Socialist Party, like the call and the early issues of the communists, the CPGB actually reported, the groups who were negotiating reported on it openly, and they reported upon their debates. So they treated their working class audience as an adult kind of audience that was able to understand all this, and that, for example, straight away they would say to the part, they said to the working class, they reported their debate on Labour Party affiliation. You can read it, it's all been reproduced in the Weekly Worker, of course, anyway. So it's all there to read. So this kind of conception of like factions coming together, bred a more kind of advanced kind of view the other we can report on our differences. We can show this, we can show this to the world, and there's no harm from it. And indeed, you know, they obviously did that because they were strengthened by it. It also has to be said that that was the standard practice in second international newspapers as well, reporting openly on your debates. It was in the BSP's paper Justice, it was in the SLP papers, and it was a standard kind of practice, and then they weren't doing anything different. And there was actually the second international, you know, prior to the First World War, predating the Russian Revolution and the Comintern, the Second International had already started working with these groups to try and unite them. I don't think much of the political level of what the way in which they was tried to do. It tended to be, I get the feeling it was more like a moral kind of ethical kind of, we should all be together. But these groups had started to overcome some, so the British Socialist Party had affiliated to the Labour Party in the middle of the First World War, with no argument from the Labour leadership. You know, because they just thought it was normal, because they were the Labour Party itself was an organisation of affiliates. So, so this process had already kind of been set in train, although obviously the events of the First World War and the Russian Revolution put that on a completely different kind of political kind of footing. So we have this kind of positive picture. But then that soon, by the time the Comintern ran a commission in 1923 to actually look at what had been happening, because basically, to cut a long story short, the early CPGB wasn't a great kind of it was successful in some kind of, you know, they had a kind of profile and it got early converts. But it wasn't actually successful in its early functioning, because what CPGB members reported about to the Comintern in 23 is that pretty much what's happening in the organisation, all the old factions are all working together. So the BSP lot are all off in the Labour Party doing their thing. The SLP lot, they're all over here, they're doing their thing. And it was a party, and it was still split, and it was still being kind of run on a kind of on a basis on which you worked with your old pals from your old kind of group. And obviously the Comintern didn't find this very acceptable. And many communists didn't find this very acceptable. They thought it was you know, a significant kind of drawback. And those personnel, those people who got into the early CPGB, they weren't really properly removed until 1929. When there was a bigger sweeping away by the Comintern of the British Party leadership. So the old guard were around, as Polly used to call them. They were around for a kind of long, they were kind of were around for a long time. But so basically, yeah, you had this kind of situation. You had a positive process with the negative, but also as well within this period as well. Of course, the early 1920s is the period of the 21 conditions of the Comintern, which is when the Comintern introduced based really on Russian conditions and the conditions of the party. There was in a civil war situation and a Russian party, the Bolsheviks, that had to militarize itself. This started to be spread through the movement, and this was long before Stalin became according to it was this militarization and what the CPGB called democratic centralization. Tom Bell wrote an article reporting on Mr. Communist. Basically, he talked of the CPGB needing to be an organized militant machine, but basically they meant a militarized machine, and that had real consequences in some senses for the CPGB as well, in the sense that quite a lot of the dialogue of the early CPGB and the talks about finance, if you read some of Kevin Morgan's books on this, they actually were quite interested in forming militias and buying weapons and all this type of stuff. So in some senses, and there was a big squabble in one of the Scottish minefields because one of the miners' groups had done a miner's bullet and a rifle as the kind of logo. So they were quite into this militarized kind of sense of themselves. They took it on, and it was, after a while, it was jumped and thought to be completely, this is unserious, you know, in particular conditions we are, maybe not unserious in the general strike, you'd argue. Yeah, so this idea of this militarization kind of caught hold. But then we then kind of move into the mid-20s kind of situation under which there was a process underway in the communist movement called Bolshevization. Now, most people know the story about Bolshevization in the sense it was to create more pliant parties for the Comintern leadership. That was certainly like a motivation of that, but I don't deny. But Bolshevization had a funny kind of outcome in Britain, alongside because the party was a bit of a shambles. It was quite disorganised. So I think the British Party, on balance, did become more effective as a result of Bolshevization. But while Bolshevization, if you look at the 1925 Comintern Executive Committee's kind of detail of what this involved, they did talk about things like complete ideological unanimity, you know, the bad theory of kind of unity. But on the other hand, they had other things in it which still preserved the right. Didn't preserve the right to faction, but it preserved the right to kind of disagree and a certain limited type of dissent in that. But the real outcome of Bolshevization from the CPGB, and the one that had, I think, quite a dramatic kind of impact on this work, was in terms of working with the Labour left and working with the National Left-Wing movement. The National Left-Wing movement was a creation of Bolshevization. It was part of that kind of move. Whereas before, the CPGB worked in quite a shambolic way in the Labour Party, quite a disorganised kind of way, and a way which kind of left it open around the period of the first Labour government to be quite opportunist in its political practice. The National Left-Wing movement was a way of dealing with that kind of problem. And it basically said that the goal of the National Left-Wing movement at the beginning of it was to make left-wing Labourites into communists. That was its goal. So we've talked in the last session about sometimes you need to demarcate yourself. The kind of modus operandi of the National Left-Wing movement was for not to leave Labourites as Labourites. It was to make them into communists and win them to the communist kind of party. And that was a more kind of positive side of it. What actually happened in practice was that this didn't actually work in the sense that you've got the old familiar patterns that you find when organisations that try and have a high degree of internal unanimity, they start projecting that outwards. So you get like things, reports from London where CPGB is, they say, oh, well, they're all just bloody playing along with the labour rights. They're just agreeing with them. There's unities and unities say. So that it actually couldn't be operative, that kind of thing. But the goal of the national left-wing movement to make labour rights into communism, to demarcate yourself, and it also had a programme that would demarcate it from the rest of the labour left. That was, in some senses, a programme of democratic kind of demands, really, which what the left-wing programme kind of was. So there was this element to like differentiate and demarcate yourself. And there was a conception, at least still, of differentiation in kind of unity. That didn't really work in the Labour Party. I think probably there's, really all the reports say that, on the ground kind of things so that the CPGB struggled to make the national level a reality. But there was also the Sunday worker in that period. The Sunday worker was very different to what then became the daily worker. The daily worker, as it was launched in the third period in 1930, did have some debate in it, but the Sunday worker was absolutely like ram-packed full of debate on all sorts of questions, ranging from the Labour left to the trade unions, to art and culture, to sport, to anything. Its columns were kind of filled with working class correspondents, all arguing with communists, differences of opinion on this, all this kind of stuff. So this was the most, so you still have this idea because, and the CPGB didn't have a lot of choice other than to launch a paper, other than the Sunday Worker, because the project of the Sunday Worker and the National Left-Wing was to win left-wing workers who they conceded were different themselves. And they, rather than trying to approach them on the basis of that kind of low-level politics, there was actually a debate, and that carried on throughout the Sunday Worker kind of period. This culture, where there is a demarcation between the party and the proletariat, where there is differentiation and when there is debate, this actually gets unpicked in the third period. Everybody knows the kind of basic points about the third period in the CPGB: class against class, the Labour Party's the third capitalist class, and even in some instances, a social fascist organisation. Everybody knows they're the kind of top lines. But what also underlined the third period was a very different conception about the party's audience. No longer was it dealing with the basis on we're going to approach these people with a programme of our principles and try and win you to communism. The idea became we're much more familiar with of approaching workers on the basis of immediate demands, trying to win them in this kind of in a very immediate sense. So if you read the Class Against Class 29 election programme, yes, you've got lots of blood-curdling messages about the third capitalist party and the Labour Party, lots of messages about revolutionary workers' government. But you'll see tacked within that is a section of immediate demands around things like unemployment relief, 7-hour working day, and pensions. And so, but if you look at the way CPGB leaders talked about what they were doing, they actually said, we don't want to work in the way we used to work with the left-wing programme. We want to go to the working class on immediate demands. And as the party sank it more and more into the mire during the third period, the Comintern also put the organisation under pressure as well. So in 1931, I think it was, CPGB launched the Workers' Charter, which was basically just a fairly minimalistic list of trade union demands that we're all kind of used to. It starts approaching workers on this low kind of level, build unity with workers on these kind of immediate issues. And this carries on through the Popular Front era when there's a formal shift in policies towards potentially you can work with national conservatives or liberals or whatever that is. But so this approach to the working class lasted through both of those kind of movements, and so therefore you have a new kind of you have a conception, a very weak conception of unity emerge. It's a unity with workers around their immediate needs. So therefore politics gets relegated. And that, as I say, that lasts across the third period and across the popular front period. The kind of best way, the kind of quite a good way to kind of exemplify this is to actually look how the party saw the working class in fictional terms. Because there was, in the 30s, there was quite a lot of party novels that started to be appeared about working class struggle or working class life. And in these books, it's only when you start actually looking at these books and their view of like the working class and the way the party works with the class that you can see what's strange and how different to the formation period this kind of become. So if you look, there's a book, there's two books that were written just at the end of the third period. There's Harold Heslop, who wrote Last Cage Down, which is about miners' struggles in the Northeast. And there's also another book called, more famous book by John Summerfield called Mayday. John Summerfield was a writer who had a significant, he wrote quite a lot, and it was in the party until the 50s or 60s, I think. Heslop, I can't remember what happened to him. But both of these books, Harold Heslop's Last Cage Down, is all about, it's about communists being part of their community, but it's also really the communists don't really talk to working class people in political terms. They don't treat them as rational or enlightened. They treat them rather as people who are being strung around by poverty, by struggle, by hardship, by that. But then there's a really strange passage in the Harold Heslop book, because it's obviously written in 1934. And in 1934, Georgy Dimitrov got himself acquitted in the Reichstag of his involvement in the Reichstag fire, which is when the Nazis set fire in the Reichstag. It was done by an anarchist with mental health problems who they blamed communists. So when Georgy Dimitrov got himself acquitted, and he in the town, he stood down and he faced his accusers. And it was you can see there's an old image of Georgy Dimitrov that they do in montage with towers over his fascist accusers. The laugh about this was that Georgy Dimitrov was a fucking massive booby prize. What would you rather have? Would you rather have the German workers' movement running in all its kind of with all its problems smashed by the Nazis, or would you have fucking Georgy Dimitrov? I think I know what I'd like to pick. So this was a booby prize. But anyway, it was something that was given that I think the Communist Party was quite shell-shocked about what happened to the German workers' movement. I'm talking about our rank and file kind of level, given that if you read any communist newspaper in Britain in the 1920s, they were full of pictures about our German comrades and about the mighty, German kind of workers, and still that perception. So, but what this book does is has this very weird passage where these people who work in the village, they're not communists. They're not part of the party. They haven't been politically involved or anything. But then suddenly there's almost a sense in which it starts talking about their collective thought as a village, going out to Dimitrov over the oceans, standing up against the fascists in the Reichstag. It's almost, it's almost got very poetic. It's like as the walls of fascism howl, our heart goes out to Comrade Dimitrov. It's very weird. You think of that as a conception of like working class consciousness and think it's like H.P. Lovecraft, or it's very weird, and it's almost mystical or supernatural. But then you can look in John Summerfield Mayday, and Mayday is not that much better, really. The book is about London, and the book is about a strike in London. and it's all out for May Day. And it's an interesting book. The communists actually hijacked the radio station. The guy goes on and does an announcement saying, for Soviet Britain and all this kind of stuff. So there's things to kind of like about it and enjoy about that book. But its actual conception, what it is there's a girl gets mangled in a machine in a factory. That stirs the workers up into life. They're all on speed up, so they're all being prodded into action by this. And then they all come out on May Day, and that's when the book kind of finishes with the indication that the revolution's going to happen. But in some of the passages where John Summerfield talks about, he does all these kind of meters of rhymes about. It's based on John Dos Passos's USA. It's a takeoff of that. But so in this book, he's actually talking about working class people and their consciousness, and he talks about working class women with their frizzy perms and lipstick and all the men all caught up in the world of horse racing and everything. So you get this completely irrational view of like the proletariat, but they're suddenly going to be sparked into force by like that Napster and the fact. Now I'm not denying that type of thing can happen, but normally for that thing to take hold and to take fire, you normally need an pre-existing organisation that's got that's there. So it's a very strange view of consciousness. There's never any view of like working class people as rational, really kind of literate, thoughtful. They're not stupid. I mean, they're not drawn in, they're not drawn unsympathetically. Some of them are drawn very sympathetically, but they're non-political animals. And every CPGB book that you read from that point onwards until you get to about 1960 and Margot Hyman's The Adventurers, which was written as a critique of that type of novel, the stupid boy who discovers communism in a factory. Oh, blimey, governor, now I've seen the light that we've got this feeder. I must become a governor. She actually took the piss out of that in some articles. And The Adventurers is about a rediscovery of a working class in Wales that's kind of literate, and it's advanced, and it's going to criticize communists, and it's going to you have to have a dialogue with working class people to win. So, but you can see from those kind of examples how weird the CPGB's kind of culture kind of was. So I'm going to move into the last bit of this talk now.
Yeah, good later.
Okay. So I'm going to move on the story a bit now, and again into the middle 30s, the end of the third period, the beginning of the Popular Front. The Labour Party sent, the CPGB sent lots of its members with the agreement of what was left of the Comintern at that point, and with the full knowledge of the various Soviet agents who were then overseeing the CPGB in London, unfortunately. They were told and encouraged, and they also wanted to anyway. They were encouraged to send members into the Labour Party, which we now kind of know about that. This was more. It wasn't like the entering of the. It wasn't like being in the Labour Party in the 1920s, where people were pretty open about their communism, and they'd been in the organisation for years as BSP, CPGB members, and couldn't really hide any. This was far more of a secretive kind of entry as organisation. You can actually read. You can read in Trotsky's journals at the time. They constantly talked about, the hidden communists who were in the Labour Party. It was kind of a well-known thing, but it was actually quite secretive. But when you consider unity, what kind of unity were they seeking with Labour Party members? It was. This tactic was always distrusted by Palmer, and he said we've got a new type of secret member in it, and we just call them half-baked communists. These people who've gone in the party, they've either gone in there or they've been recruited within the Labour Party, and they're just half-baked. And Dot was always jumping up and down to try and yank them out. He eventually got his way, and the war happened. So the fact that Doug called them half-baked communists gives you a pretty good idea of what their actual politics were kind of like. And it's pretty much the same criticism that you'd make of what militants were in the Labour Party in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, like when you all saw that they'd all taken on the clothes of labourers. That's what they'd actually done. You actually become, if you have a more secretive, you actually become Labourites, which is what they became. So, but when you actually look at the type of politics that the CP took into the Labour Party and the Labour League of Youth, which they took over and ran under Ted Willis, remember him? So they in 1937, I think it was, they proposed, and they were in the leadership. They were running this organisation. They were in command, and the Labour Party, even though the Labour Party had to try and disaffiliate all these organisations and get rid of them, they actually couldn't dislodge them. They were so deeply, wedged in. But this is obviously of the Popular Front era. They had a charter for youth in 1937, which had things like fight to maintain peace, fight for trade unionism, fight for strong youth rights and demands, a strong socialist youth international, and to recruit to the Labour League of Youth, and to put forward something called the complete socialist ideal, which I think they never specified what that is. So these are seriously weak politics it's putting in, and it's the CPGB is obviously still in this kind of tranche of like dealing with. They're not taking high politics into the Labour Party. That would only really be introduced if they were trying to look for support from the Soviet Union or from what the Soviet Union was doing. That would be the only instance in which they would introduce it. And so this is therefore, that's why you get half-baked communists, because this is not really a communist political project as such. So this was quite basically these people they recruited. It wasn't particularly useful for the organisation in the long term, because as Ted Willis wrote later on, when they all left, they were all yanked out at the beginning of the Second World War, and they were yanked out and told they were all yanked out, and they all wrote valedictory kind of like articles to the Daily Worker saying, "I'm leaving Labour to join the politics." But it didn't actually, as Ted Willis kind of recognised, they didn't actually grow. They didn't actually gain anything from this. They left quite a lot of people behind, and the people that they recruited were often the people who can serve them in the first place anyway. It wasn't a particularly successful tactic. And in the end, they ended up, by yanking them out in such a public fashion, it's so obvious. You get people who've been communists for a long time saying, I've left the Labour Party to join the CPGB after reading the new history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. I was completely wrong by this. I mean, it is so false and transparent, and it pissed off, it poisoned relations with the Labour left for a whole period. Now, I've got no real sympathy with the Labour Party or the Labour left, but I can see why they were annoyed. So Stafford Cripps wrote a long article in Tribune about all these absences. So I'm not saying that people need to be pacified, but it wasn't a great. It was a swing from a completely opportunist to a completely sectarian, which is again a classic movement of organisations that can't. The organisations that try and be unanimous internally, they find it really hard to operate that in the external kind of world. So the last bit I'm going to talk about really is the opening of the Second World War. And again, you people in this room will probably know that the CPGB initially supported the war. There's a pamphlet by Harry Pollock called How to Win the War, supporting the Second World War as a kind of popular struggle against Nazism. I'm having to massively truncate this and do this. But then, of course, there was a shift over after the Soviet Union, after the signing of the Nazi-Soviet Pact. The war was then deemed to be an imperialist war, and the CPGB got instructed to change its line. And we all kind of know about that. What actually happened in the CPGB is that the organisation was forced into a position which it had to demarcate itself. It had to, in some senses, it was against the stream. Suddenly, it was anti-war, and the types of books that the CPGB members were being encouraged to read, and they were reading, were Lenin's books from 1914. I think they were collected in I think there was is it Socialism and War? I can't remember. There's a particular volume that was like, I've seen the sales figures, and they sold about 40,000 copies of that. They sold a lot. They were pushing this thing, and it was all. There was a sense in this, of course, that there was an element in this that the main enemy was at home, and that was the type of things they were being taught and told. In practice, that's not the politics. The politics in reality were much more opportunist than that. They were couched in the language of peace, cross-caste collaboration, and they were also, the CPGB did do, the CPGB had certain sections that it was also interested in dealing with the immediate things about air and shelters, which I thought was like big issue, big issues, going down into the tube stations, all that kind of stuff was led by communists and others. Members and Trotskyists as well were involved in that, which we shouldn't forget. But so in practice, the politics were actually much more opportunist. But you couldn't escape from the fact that the communists was suddenly had to demarcate themselves, and they just had to. So you read about CPGB members, like when Finland was invaded, obviously the Soviet Union invaded Finland. So suddenly the CPGB are in a tiny minority on that issue. Because the ruling class were like, much like Ukraine, were bombarding Finland on one different thing, but they were playing fucking Finlandia on the BBC radio every morning. All this kind of nonsense was going on. The members of CPGB members in that period is of having speaker stands knocked over. They were going around with loudspeakers, with banging on it. I mean, they were in a minority, and so you couldn't. So they were back in the situation in which they couldn't. It's much more difficult. They had to defend their politics. They had to support the Soviet Union. So suddenly they're in that situation. But it was kind of interesting with kind of Jane's face of the CPGB at that time. You can read like two kind of memoirs. You can look at Edward Upward's diaries. Edward Upward, I've read his diaries in the British Library. Edward Upward wasn't disconcerted at all. And he just said, when the CPGB was criticised for being pro-Nazi, which they kind of were, which was a common kind of thing, and the CPGB would give the Nazis demands an airing. All up to get from that. Well, the main enemies at home. Now you can argue about the rights and the wrongs of that, but he was quite clear on it. And he's good. I've read all of the stuff I've been reading. I think the main enemy is at home. So therefore, he was fairly anaesthetised to all that kind of pressure. And actually, some other members did like the new line as well. It's always deemed to be always terribly unpopular. They'd rather be on the popular front. That wasn't true. There was a whole generation who'd been through the third period, which was quite hardcore politics. Some of them didn't mind it. But then you go from Edward Upward to Jack Lindsay. Jack Lindsay was a kind of writer, he wrote fucking hundreds of books. He must have wrote about 200 books on all sorts of topics. But he was recruited to CPGB circles when it was all the Spanish Civil War. He did all these declamatory poems in favour of the Spanish, supporting the Spanish Republic and all this kind of stuff. So Jack Lindsay was a more classical popular front recruit. And in a book he published in 1956 called After the 30s, which is a kind of a lament for the lost popular front, he recounts being in a transport cafe surrounded by lorry drivers eating egg and chips, having an argument with Finland. And he said how absolutely horrified he was, because he was the only person there who was prepared to defend the Soviet Union. So you have two kind of sides of this. There's one side of the party which is quite happy with this, and then you look at other works of that period, like Douglas Hyde, I Believed, which talks about the Communist Party members being involved in illegal work to establish printing presses all across London. and about preparing for illegality, and that's also in Nan Burgess' reminiscences. She remembers that period just being intellectual study of Lenin in 1914 and preparing for illegality. It's a very strange organisation, but one wing of it's completely disconcerted and prefer to be back in the popular front. Where another's like, yeah, there was a kind of sense of that. Now, that doesn't disguise the fact that the CPG's politics were quite radically opportunist in terms of what they actually said. And actually, by the time you get to the eve of the Soviet Union being invaded, they've kind of gone back to a much more economistic kind of politics. But nevertheless, it's real. I'm just going to finish on this, really. I've been doing some work on the CPGB's draft program of like 1939, which I first read about in John's book, which I was one of the few people to actually write about it, and it's quite obscure. I found out it was launched. There was a long series in the Daily Worker. It wasn't aborted as well. I think it was just taken over by events, is my view of it. Well, I'm not going to go too much into the details of this, but my contention, although the draft program in 1939 is a mess, and quite incoherent in places, that when I first read it, it read to me like an Erfurt type program, because it's clearly got a project in some of these sections for a democratic republic, as the route through to the socialist revolutions. Is tacked on to other kind of sections that are more economistic in the media. And so when I began investigating this and looking into the internal documentation, I found, I'm not going to read these, I'm not going to read them, but I found CPGB articles telling their comrades that their inspirations for their draft program were the 1903 Russian RSDLP program, and the Austrian. I can't say that. You can say that. But then I found a letter that Sam Dutt, who's Rajani Palm Dutt's wife, that she wrote to Pollitt, and it's in the Pollitt kind of archive. And just as the ending of this, I'm just going to read out this because it does explain rather well these letters. They explain this kind of split personality of the Communist Party in this period. But she said to Pollitt had written to complain about what's this draft program shit, what's all this principle, what's all this, because Pollitt was like man of action. And this was just before the change of line as well, on the World War. She wrote, the draft program which we prepared was a compromise between different conceptions. It's quite different from the program I had vaguely in mind during our talk with Pollitt. As you remember, I spoke of a short, simple business-like document of not more than 7,500 words, something like the old Erfurt program or the Russian program. I think she used the RSDLP program, 1903, but of course not the same contents. Putting forward our demands in all spheres and preceded by a concise, up-to-date argument included an explanation of the party. This is to be accompanied later by an extremely popularly written commentary or explanatory booklet, similar to Kautsky's class report or Bukharin's ABC. This is in 1939, by the way, in Soviet kind of intellectual circles. These people had begun to promote persons. Bukharin had been shot as being a traitor, and she's so this program was to serve for consolidating the party, every new member to receive a copy, presenting a short, clear statement for all designed to know what the party's general program is, as we could not use the CPCI, Communist International Program, for that purpose. And this is a concession to Pollitt. And at the same time, I proposed as a mass agitation weapon the issue of immediate program for the People's Front written by you. So on one level, you have this kind of principled strategic presentation of aims, and then she's telling Pollitt, well, you get on writing your thing. And guess which one I guess would have got more publicity. But she also Sam Dutt wrote another letter to Pollitt, which does again explains this kind of Janus face. When she's talking about Marxist education and how shit she thinks it is in the CPGB. Again, this is August 1939. She said, it's not the first time I've come across objections to Marxist education among the party comrades, nor is it news to you. The British governing class cannot bear to have the subject classes think and analyse. They may by accident come to the conclusion that things are not as they should be. And she says about Palm Dut's books, the party members hate Raj's books and writings because they analyse. They either think them unnecessary and useless, or they know about all the subject already. So this is the two kind of sides of the Communist Party's identity. There's one side which does perceive itself as having differences and having a strategic, strategic aims. There's another side of the party which is wedded into the more base idea, really, of just approaching the workers on a minimalistic basis. So I'm going to end there because I've got thanks for far too long. So thanks for your forbearance.